Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Australia. I'm your host, Lee Constable, and today we're talking about the parched earth and our challenges in understanding future droughts in a warmer world. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am broadcasting to you from. I'm on the land of the Gubbi Gubbi people, and so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as acknowledge the ongoing relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the over 250 nations that make up what we now call Australia have with land, sea, other waterways, and the sky. So today's episode, as I mentioned, is about drought. Lucky we don't have a drought right now here in Australia, at least where I am, touch wood. We've just come out of a drought. So a lot of people across Australia have experience with drought firsthand, or because they are aware, perhaps in their metropolitan bubbles, that people are dealing with drought in a more immediate way in the regions. I myself am someone with an intense interest in drought. In fact, growing up in the Millennium Drought on our family's sheep farm in New South Wales, where my parents are still farming today, is what got me interested in climate change and the relationship between humans and the climate. And now has led me here. I'm still learning. I've still got lots to learn. And it turns out drought is a lot more complex and challenging to understand than even I took for granted going into this. So I've got three of our excellent researchers from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes joining me, and I'll introduce them one by one now. So firstly, I'll introduce to you Professor Nerily Abram, who is a CLEC's Chief Investigator and Co-Lead of Drought. She is an amazing person with a huge bio of achievements, including being lead author of the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. She uses paleoclimate records to study how Earth's climate has behaved in the past and provide a long-term perspective on recent climate change, especially how rainfall will change over Australia. The next guest that I will introduce to you is Associate Professor Andrea Teschetto, who is CLEC's Chief Investigator, again in the Drought program. Andrea's research looks at how ocean temperatures affect the global climate and impact rainfall over Australia. She's particularly interested in understanding the links between climate phenomena such as El Nino, Southern Oscillation, and drought in Australia. And our final of three, last but certainly not least, we have Professor Jason Evans, who's CLEC's chief investigator and co-lead of the Drought program. Professor Jason Evans' expertise is in the area of regional climate, land-atmosphere interactions, the water cycle, and climate change. His focus is on regional climate change and its impacts, but he also, I should say, has been an IPCC lead author, is an editor with the Journal of Climate, and was a Green Globe Sustainability Champion finalist, which sounds terribly exciting, Jason. It's great to have you all here. Welcome, and thanks for telling us a bit about drought today. Jason, what is a Green Globe Sustainability Champion, first of all?
This is an award that's run by the New South Wales government, and it really is just to recognise people who've been putting a lot of time and effort into sustainable solutions for some of our major environmental problems in Australia.
Great. Well, congratulations.
Thank you. I was bettered by some people who've done a lot of great work as well in that.
There's always people doing lots of great work out there, peeping you at the post, which is a good problem to have. So I'll start with you, Nerily, asking you some questions. Let's start with the big one. It might seem basic, but the more you think about it, it's not so simple. What is drought?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really tricky one to answer. There's no one definition as to what a drought is. So we can talk about drought in terms of being a lack of rainfall. We can talk about drought as where the soil has dried out, and we can talk about drought where that lack of rainfall and dry soil has then led to difficulty for plants to be growing. And then all of those different aspects of drought have the social impact as well. So drought is, it's a difficult concept to just say this is what a drought is.
Right. Yeah. So defining what drought is obviously a challenge in itself, and distinguishing between, is this just a drier year than usual, or a couple of years, or how long does it need to be going on? So there are a lot of challenges in defining drought, but also measuring drought. Could you explain what some of those big challenges are?
Yeah, so drought is quite different to some of our other climate extremes. So we have climate extremes that we regularly sort of talk about, like a heat wave that might last for sort of a few days, or an intense period of rain, which might only be sort of a few hours. But for drought, we're talking about a climate event that can be sustained across multiple years. And when we look back at Australia's observational climate record, we actually only have sort of a handful of past droughts to draw upon, and to be trying to draw those sort of, look at those sort of conclusions as to okay, what causes droughts? What causes droughts to break? Are droughts getting worse? That's really hard to do with the length of instrumental data that we have. And so one of the ways that we can tackle that is by using paleoclimate data to go a lot further back in the past. So we start to build up more of an idea of just what the natural range of droughts is and what's possible. One of the things that we see when we look a long way back in the past is that it's possible in Australia to have droughts that are much, much worse than what we've experienced in the last 100 years. And that's even without any influence of sort of the ways that humans are changing the climate and causing droughts to become worse. But just because of natural variability, there's one of the droughts that we see for Australia, particularly from ice core records from Antarctica, and using that to infer the lack of rainfall that parts of Australia we're receiving. There's evidence of droughts in the past lasting for 30 years. And so
wow.
The concept of what that would mean if we had one of those droughts today, if we have a drought for a few years today, that really starts to put stress both on our agricultural industries, but also just on providing water resources to our cities and those types of things. But what would happen if we had a drought of that length today? So that's one of the ways that we try and overcome that problem of having a really short instrumental record to be trying to understand drought from.
Yeah, and the idea of going through drought that's longer than my life is not one that I actually want to experience firsthand. When we think about, paleoclimate, we're thinking about, what do we know from all of these records before human-made written records and measured observations could be referred to? Is Australia just dry, or are we thinking of drought now the same way we did 10 or 20 years ago? What's changed there?
Yeah, over the past few years, there has been definitely a shift in the way that scientists are looking at drought and how we frame this problem. So particularly, I think in the past, we've generally tried to think of droughts, and I apologise for my noisy background here. Everyone's in lockdown. Apologies for that. But we typically think of, have in the past thought of drought as being just a period of time where it didn't rain. Whereas actually part of this reframing is actually thinking of looking at Australia and saying, actually, we're naturally a dry country. The normal state is probably some sort of form of drought. And what's really important is when we have high rainfall events that break a drought. And so what's going to happen in the future in terms of those drought-breaking rain events? Will they happen more often or less often? And what does that tell us about our future risk?
Yeah, and I suppose this is where, Andrea, it's your time to shine when it comes to talking about drought breaking. People might be a bit confused when they first hear what you do. And they might think, what does the ocean have to do with drought? Could you explain what this link is?
Yeah, so the oceans play a really important role in modulating the rainfall in Australia. So the tropical Pacific and the tropical Indian Ocean are really important because they have those phenomena, as we call the modes of variability. The ones that we know more is the El Niño Southern Oscillation that has this relationship with Australian rainfall. And we've known that for decades by looking at past data and doing statistical analysis with these climate modes indices. And so when an El Nino occurs in the tropical Pacific, generally the Eastern Pacific becomes warmer than normal. And that changes the atmospheric circulation in a way that affects Australia as well, and the weather patterns for Australia. So in the case of an El Nino, it tends to be associated with dry weather in Australia. And the opposite phase, which is a La Nina, when the Eastern Pacific is cooler than usual, then it tends to be associated with wet weather for Australia. So you can imagine that when El Niños and La Niñas happen, then there is this association with having more or less rainfall, and in the past with related some of the droughts and floods with this natural phenomenon in the Pacific, the El Niño Southern Oscillation.
So we can talk about, drought. Neroli mentioned how drought has been a kind of natural part of the Australian continent's way of being dry, I should say, potentially not drought, whether or not we want to define it as that. And you're talking about other phenomena related to that happen with the ocean, that happen over years, not just within a year. So does this mean that if we had a change in this ocean variability, we'd see a change in drought as well? Have you done any research to indicate that might be the case?
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's a fascinating topic, actually. So a few years ago, I decided to test that by simulating a hypothetical scenario where we basically exclude all the ocean variability. So you can imagine that it's a world that we don't have El Niños happening or Indian Ocean dipoles happening. So every year, the temperature in the ocean would be the same. right? And what we found out from this exercise, from this simulation, is that the ocean variability is extremely important for determining the intensity of drought in Australia and the duration as well. But more than that is when we exclude all these modes of variability, we still see drought in Australia. But those droughts are quite different than what we see in our world. They are less intense and they tend to last longer, which is quite surprising. But this just shows how important are those modes of variability for determining the duration of drought or making this breaking droughts, basically.
Yeah, because I suppose when you think about a drought, you've got the thing that caused the onset of the dry period and the things that extend that over the course of years. And then you also have the other element, which is the end of the drought, as you mentioned, the breaking of the drought, which obviously, because of your research, you can see has everything, has a lot to do with ocean variability, with enzo and with the Indian Ocean dipole as well. I was wondering what we see as the impact of climate change on enzo potentially into the future.
Yeah, we had a recent review on enzo in a warming climate, and what we see is that there is projection of enzo that it's will tend to be a little bit more intense in the future, the variability. But what we basically see that is related to drought is the change in the mean state in the Pacific rather than the change in enzo variability. So it's really hard. We don't know exactly if the enzo will in the future change, let's say, to be more of an Eastern Pacific warming or a Central Pacific warming. There are still uncertainties regarding that. But because the tropical Pacific tends to be warmer in the eastern side, it will change the way that those teleconnections will be for Australia. So we'll tend to see, it's quite a hard a question because there is a lot of uncertainty associated to that.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason there's uncertainty is also the reason you're all here, because if there weren't any questions at uncertainty, you wouldn't have a research program dedicated to answering these big questions. So I might now go to Jason, your side of the story, because I think this links really nicely to what you do when you're looking at land contributions. So we've talked about the contribution of the ocean, but how does land contribute to either the start or the end of a drought?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So the land obviously is a really important factor when we're thinking about drought. Well, one, because that's where we see all the impacts, really. But two, because it plays this role of intensifying the changes and adding to the persistence. So what happens is we might have a large-scale climate teleconnection coming from enzo, like Andrea was just talking about, which is El Nino providing a drying signal or drying large-scale effect to Australia. Once the land starts to dry out, that means it's able to produce, or it's only producing less evaporation, so there's less moisture in the air that's able to join to rise up into clouds and produce rain. So there's this feedback effect from the land, which increases the drying factor that's being brought to us from these large-scale effects of the ocean systems around Australia. Now, on top of that, even once the climate mode like enzo has then relaxed and gone back to a neutral state, because the land surface is already in this drying state, then its feedback is still there. So it still works to sort of keep the land in this dry state. And that adds to this persistence of the droughts that we see. Alternatively, it has the sort of a similar effect once it's in a very wet state as well. So if we get the large scale systems changing to La Nina and bringing some drought breaking rain, once the land surface is really wet, it's then able to evaporate a whole lot more moisture. It puts more moisture in the clouds, which is increasing the rain that we see over the land. And so you get this same amplification effect happening at the wet end as well as the dry end. So land really plays this role of amplifying the effects that are being brought from outside Australia, as well as adding to the persistence of these dry states once we're in them.
Okay, like it's a lot to take on board when I just was thinking previously about drought as, you know, I was thinking about enso in terms of it's drier now and thinking about the lack of rain, but when you then factor in the feedback loop of the drier it is, the drier it will stay, and the more ground cover you have because of having more rain, the more we can hold on to that water and prevent drought and break and keep the rain that falls. So there's so many different factors. I can see why Neroli pointed out at the beginning how complex drought is in terms of not just defining it but measuring it. When it comes to land cover, we can't just obviously think of forests, but we need to think about agriculture. What impact does climate change have potentially on agriculture when it comes to drought? And vice versa, agriculture on drought, I suppose it's a feedback loop, like you said.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things to think about here. In terms of land cover first, that different land covers have access to different amount or depths of moisture in the soils. So there's some particularly sort of forested land covers that have very deep rooted and are able to access groundwater systems and stuff. And so ecosystems like that actually have a weaker feedback loop for the dry side. So they're able to keep accessing moisture through dry cycle for much, much longer. And that decreases this land feedback and decreases then the intensity or persistence of a related drought. Other land covers, which only access very shallow soil moisture, so this is our grasslands and most of our agriculture, because they're or the annual crops, they only have root systems that grow for the growing season, so they're only accessing fairly shallow soil moisture. So those systems get this feedback loop happening much faster. As soon as you deplete the moisture from these surface layers of the soil, you start to introduce this feedback loop from the land, and that means that the droughts become more intense more quickly, and they start to enter this stage where they're getting persistence of this dry state more quickly than deeper rooted land systems would have.
So when we look at, sorry, Jason, go on.
So I was just going to then sort of bring in the climate change angle for that. So the other thing we need to think about in terms of climate change, besides the rain side of it, which we've been mostly talking about so far, is of course how we lose moisture from the land surface, which is evaporation and transpiration from our plants. Now, this is related to our temperatures, our atmospheric temperatures, because the warmer the atmosphere is, the more moisture it can hold. Okay, so you can think of increasing the temperature of the air as increasing the evaporative demand of the atmosphere. And that essentially allows the land to evaporate more or evaporate more quickly, or the plants to transpire more quickly. And we've done studies looking at what's happened over the last few decades globally in terms of evaporation. And for the vast majority of the globe, we do see robust increasing trends over the last several decades. So as we've been warming, we've been observing these increases in evaporation. So that means, so for drought, that means that obviously we're increasing the rate at which we can dry out our soils, because we're removing this moisture faster. And so we're sort of increasing the rate at which we go into a drought state. And that means we increase the rate at which we get the land into a state where it starts this feedback loop, increasing that drying again and keeping us in this sort of more persistent dry states. So we've already observed that the climate change that's happened has already been putting us into a position where we dry out faster and can be entering these drought-like states more quickly. When we think about going further into the future, it would seem, certainly from the evaporation side of things, that trend is likely to continue along with as warming continues. And so that sort of cycle of more rapid evaporation, more rapid drying of the land surface, and the feedbacks from the land surface to the atmosphere giving us these persistence in dry states is likely to be more commonly seen as we increase our evaporation from the surface.
Yeah, so a lot of different factors feed into drought, beginning the drought's duration, breaking the drought, and every single one of those factors is impacted and exacerbated by climate change.
Yeah, probably some are impacted in a fairly uniform way everywhere in the globe. So the evaporation factors I was just talking about with the increasing atmospheric demand because of increasing temperatures, that's pretty universal, and we see that everywhere. The changes in the rainfall and drought-breaking rains have a fairly strong dependency on changes in large-scale circulation, and as Andrea was mentioning, that's a bit less certain, and it's very location dependent.
Yeah.
On how those changes will play out. So there's some parts of this problem that we understand quite well and can predict fairly well, and there's other parts that, even though that we don't understand as well, and certainly our predictions have much lower confidence.
Yeah, and I should point out, if you're watching and listening to this from outside Australia, as happens on the World Wide Web, then we are talking about drought in the context of Australia particularly, but of course there will be areas of the world where drought was more common and it becomes less common, and areas where we're more worried about heavy precipitation and more storms as opposed to less. Correct? Like monsoon regions, for instance.
That's true. The changes with climate change, though, they don't separate so easily into those two categories. There's actually many places where the projections suggest that while in the mean, these places will see less rainfall, so will be drier on average. When they do get the rainfall, the rain that comes will fall at higher intensity. So you'll have bigger storms. So you have longer dry periods in between storms, and then bigger storms when they happen. So there's this result that you see in a lot of locations where you can see increases in both droughts and floods, even though at first it would seem that those two things wouldn't go together. This is a not uncommon projection when we're talking about what's going to happen because of climate change.
Yeah.
For a place like Australia, we already have a lot of droughts and a lot of floods.
Yeah.
Having more of both is probably not ideal.
No, and I'm just thinking about those feedbacks when it comes to land cover, that the more drought there is, the less potential land cover, especially across farmland. And then the heavier the rains that come, the more, topsoil washing away, the harder the wind blows, the more it blows away, the erosion issues. It all stacks up. So we are coming to the end of our half hour, but I might ask you all after we roll some credits to do a little bit of Q&A after the fact, just for a few minutes if you've got the time. But before we wrap this interview, I just wanted to give each of you the opportunity to just give us a little takeaway. What if people are watching or listening to this and thinking about drought and what that means for them and their region, what's one thing that you'd like them to take away? Either, a concept you wish more people understood, or something they can do to find out more. I'll start with you, Nerily.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So for me, I think one of the big takeaways that I think is really important that we get this message across is that our historical experience of drought doesn't cover the range of actually what's possible. And so when we're planning for the future, and particularly the potential of human-caused climate change increasing our drought risk, we also need to take that into that planning and be thinking about how would we cope with droughts that are even longer or more intense than what we've already experienced.
Yeah, and Andrea?
So for me, I just want to tell that the ocean variability is really important for the modulating rainfall variability in Australia and determining this duration and intensity of multi-year drought in Australia. It's obviously not the only thing, but it's one of the factors that we do consider for drought.
Absolutely important to consider that. Thank you. And Jason?
I'd say we should be aware that as we continue to change the climate, this will change the kind of droughts that we experience. For Southern Australia in particular, it looks like that means more droughts, probably longer droughts, more intense droughts. How we manage the land is important and will really decide the way we handle these droughts and these changes in droughts. So we need to think a lot about how we deal with managing the land.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for joining me and helping break down everything from what is drought, what does it look like in the past in Australia, what does the ocean have to do with drought, what does the land have to do with drought, everything has a lot to do with drought. I hope that if you're listening or watching this back, you'll check out more information about this. Of course, we're sharing the CLEX website, and if you've got questions, you're not the only one. That's why there's these researchers and research programs looking into getting more certainty around certain aspects of what this could mean. So appreciate your work. We're going to head into the end of our episode and show some credits, but we'll be back shortly for a little Q&A. I've got a few questions I can see in the chat for you all to answer. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
All right, we're back, and we didn't leave, in fact, would you believe? We've got some questions here to answer. The first one, and you're all welcome to jump in, will it ever be possible to forecast whether a drought will occur in a year or two in advance?
So that's a very interesting question. It's a very hard, actually, to answer that. But one thing that I can say about it is that we do have the capability to forecast modes of variability in a year in advance. So when El Niños and La Niñas are happening a year in advance, it's really hard to know when a drought will start. But if, let's say, a drought is already happening in a certain area that is affected by those modes, and if, let's say, an El Niño is happening or a La Niña is happening and bringing rain, then we can know more or less what is going to happen, what it's a tendency to either break the drought or exacerbate the drought that is already happening.
So you can say, look, we're in a drought and it's not looking good for that to be broken in the next year. Or, we potentially will have a higher likelihood of it being broken if, with the enzo switch happens that we're predicting in the next year. Great.
Can I add to... I'll add to that in that we actually, so predicting sort of like a year or 2 years, actually what we're going to see in that year is very difficult. But we can say with sort of more confidence what sort of the trends are that we expect in the future. So which parts of the country do we expect to become more drought prone? And that's, not saying it's going to be a drought in this particular year, but you can expect to be in drought conditions more often in some parts of the country.
Yeah.
I'll take the optimistic view here, and I'll say yes, we will at some stage be able to do this. If you look back over the last few decades, the knowledge we've gained over these key processes and mechanisms and climate modes, and our ability to predict these things over the last 20 years has clearly got a lot better. It might take another 20 years before we can do this, but I think we'll get there.
Yeah, well, I've noticed in the latest IPCC report, there's a lot more things being said with a lot more confidence, and obviously that goes with a lot more stark evidence as climate change progresses, but also with the changing and improvement of modelling and things like that. Question 2, is there a link between droughts and intense bushfires like those we saw in the Black Summer of 2019-2020 here in Australia? Or as I like to call it, the black spring summer, because it was both seasons.
It started early, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. And certainly in the Black Summer, the drought in Eastern Australia was a factor. So one of the factors that you need for droughts to for bushfires to become large and extreme is a dry fuel load. And so the drought that we'd seen in Eastern Australia that started in about 2017 and ran through into that 2019-2020 summer had sort of set the wheels in motion for the fuel being really dry. So then when we had those hot and dry conditions, we also had an alignment of the ocean variability as well, particularly in the Indian Ocean, with a really strong positive Indian Ocean dipole event that contributed to the dry conditions leading into that fire season. All those conditions came together to set us up for a really bad fire season that summer.
Yeah, I'll add to that. The dryness of the fuel is key for any fire at any time, and you probably only need a seasonal drought to dry the fuel out enough to have a fire of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have a drought that lasts several years, that means you're not just drying out the leaves or the litter on the ground. You're drying out parts of branches and larger fuel elements in the system. And having a fire, once you've dried out these large elements, this is when you can get really large, dangerous, extreme fires being fueled by those large dry fuel elements.
Yeah, I've got a question leading on from this. This one actually comes from Andrew Watkins. Hi, Andrew. Great to have you watching. Who asks, and some of this we've mentioned, droughts now often lead to large fires, Black Summer, Black Saturday. Do you think this is because we swing from very wet and grow more vegetation and fuels to very dry? Obviously, you've touched on some of this. And why do you think these swings have been happening with only short periods of neutral and benign? I suppose this goes in some way to enzo. Anyone want to tackle those questions?
Maybe I can answer that. So enzo is a natural phenomenon, right? So it occurs from 3 to 7 years in our climate system. So what we've seen in the historical record is that there was a tendency in the present, like in the recent years, to have more Central Pacific El Niños that have an impact on Eastern Australia. But I'm actually not sure if this swings that is, like wet and dry periods has become like more frequent in past years, actually. So there is a change that we've observed a change towards a Central Pacific El Niños and that has an impact for Eastern Australia, but not necessarily like a strong swings related to enzo.
I'll add to that. So the first part of the question, I guess, is yes. You need to have fuel there. So if you have a wet period and you grow the vegetation really well, that means you have a lot of fuel. And then if you have a dry period and you dry that fuel out, now you've got a lot of fuel, not just vegetation. Now you've got a lot of fuel for your fire.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that cycle that really does help Australia be a land afire. And this is why a lot of our native vegetation, a lot of our eucalypts and stuff are very well adapted to fire. It's been like this for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the climate change, as the globe's warmed, we have seen an increase in evaporation rates. So if you have a cycle, a wet dry cycle, like Andrea was just talking about, even without a major change in that cycle, if you're evaporating more during the cycle, that means you enter that dry phase faster, and you can get drier more frequently. So we have this wet dry cycle. If anything, we're getting into our dry part of that phase faster on the land. It's drying out faster because of the evaporation, and that means it is primed to burn more readily.
Yeah, and I suppose we also have to talk about wind, because whilst wind might not necessarily increase fuel when it comes to all of the dry vegetation on the ground, it does prevent burning off, at different times of year when we've potentially done fuel reduction burns. Are we seeing those sorts of conditions reduced?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And particularly, I mean, winds are a really important part when we actually have fires as well, in terms of allowing fires to spread faster and become quite dangerous. There's a little bit of evidence suggesting that in a warmer climate, we may have more of that frontal activity across southern Australia, so potentially increasing our fire risk. But it's fairly sort of uncertain. And one of the reasons is whether our climate models can actually capture those frontal processes in a good enough way. And so that's one of the areas where looking to how we take this research forward is looking at how can we get those weather scale processes in our sort of large scale climate models, so we can start to reduce the uncertainty as to how those processes are going to change in the future.
Yeah, and we've had some great discussions previously with ARC, Centre of Climate Extremes researchers, on the need for more research into improving climate modelling for those reasons. Obviously, we want to be able to know more and with more certainty on every factor.
I could just add something to this conversation, Lee. So if we're thinking about conditions that are suitable to do prescribed burning, we've looked directly into this, and we've already seen that the usual windows that we use in eastern and southern Australia, which is usually in the sort of May or October, November time period to do this prescribed burning, the days where you have suitable conditions have been decreasing in the last several decades in those windows. And it looks like with climate change, that's going to continue to be the case. They'll further decrease in those windows. So, which means there's less opportunity to do this kind of prescribed burning in those times, which is probably not good news. But by the same token, that through the winter months, you start to see more and more periods where you have those same conditions that we would burn in today. They start occurring more in the winter. So it could really just be a matter of changing the management here so that more prescribed burning is happening through winter months rather than being restricted just to the spring and the autumn.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different things for policymakers and decision makers to take into account when we're thinking about what we can do as humans. And definitely, if you're in the business of fighting and fire reduction through prescribed burning, then that's something to think about. Or whether we need more staffing for controlled burns so we can do more controlled burns on the days when it's possible. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad idea. Just spitballing some ideas.
Well, in a lot of states of Australia, it's done by a lot of volunteers, these prescribed burns. So staffing is always a question there.
Staffing is always a question. Shout out to anyone who's a volunteer firefighter. I know my parents are in the volunteer brigade back home. But yes, we have had a lot of discussions around the idea that tackling a lot of these issues means we need people on the ground who are able to help. I'm just checking. We've got one more question from Andrew before we wrap up. No, he just says, oh, yes, thanks for your answer. That was great. How confident are you in projections for changes in the Indian Ocean dipole towards more positive events, such as the one before the Black Summer? He asked. I think that's one for you, Andrea.
Yeah, so the projections tells the models, most of the models tells us that the Indian Ocean will change towards a positive Indian Ocean dipole, so positive Indian Ocean dipole-like pattern. And that pattern generally is associated with drier conditions for the southern parts of Australia and the southeast. The episode that we had in 2019 was a really unusual episode. It was super extreme Indian Ocean dipole, and that happened. This episode didn't actually co-occur with enzo. So generally, in our historical record, we see a lot of these Indian Ocean dipoles co-occurring with enzo, and that's why it's so complicated to understand the impacts over Australia, because they combine, and their combined effect tends to be exacerbated in Australia. Mm-hmm. So these interactions are quite complicated. So the projections tends to tell us that will be towards a positive Indian Ocean dipole, and there are studies showing that Indian Ocean dipole will become more frequent in the future as well, and extreme El Niños more frequent in the future. So this certainly will have an impact for Australian rainfall.
Yeah, and Nerily, we were talking about the future just there with Andrea, but what about the past? I know you've done some research into IOD, or Indian Ocean dipole, going back into the past.
Yeah, and this is a really nice example where if we bring together a whole range of evidence, we can start to say things more confidently than if we just look at the climate models for the future. We know that there's some things that the climate models we're not confident that they get the Indian Ocean dipole exactly sort of as it actually occurs. But when we combine it with looking at our observational record, where in the observational record, it appears that these events are becoming more common and they're becoming stronger. And then we can also couple that with paleoclimate data, and we can go back many hundreds of years using coral records from the tropical Indian Ocean. And that really helps to cement this concept that we are seeing a change in the way the Indian Ocean dipole operates. These positive events, like the one that we saw in 2019, they're becoming more common. It's more common for these events to be very strong. But again, we get this warning when we look at paleoclimate evidence that it's actually possible for these events to be even stronger than that 2019 event. So just with natural variability, the Indian Ocean can do even more than what we've seen in the last 100 years or so.
Wow. Well, thank you all for this. It's been a really enlightening discussion, and I could talk your ears off for hours, but I do have to let you go so that you can go about your business of answering some of these big questions that we're asking you. I appreciate your time. Thanks again to everyone who's been watching. We've been streaming on Simpatico TV, which is the home of Climate Australia, and also to those of you who've been watching on Facebook and YouTube, thank you very much. Where can people find out more? The CLEX website is great. Do you recommend anywhere else that people go to find out a bit more about Drought or your work?
The CLEX website would be the first place to find us and get further links to the work that we're doing personally. Mm-hmm. I'd say, obviously, we've just recently had the new IPCC report come out, so anyone who would like to find out more about what's being projected for the future and more about the processes themselves and how they work, they do have quite a nice sort of summaries in that report and some nice figures that sort of give a good guide to how the processes all work together and interact. So I'd recommend checking that out as well.
Great, thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks to you all, and thanks to everyone for watching. And that's it from us. So goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.